Recording in progress.
Ooh, let's pause that. All right, we're going to assume that recording is working. Our speaker connection seems a little funny. Last time we talked about all the fill in the blanks on the listing agreement, which took a long time. This time we have a lot to get through because we're going to go through all the actual words of the listing agreement, which, I think it's very important that we look at that. And then hoping that we have enough time at the end, we're going to do something that listing agents have to do every so often, which is deal with the customer acknowledgement or agreement to work with the buyer as a customer or whatever it's called now, form. So let's just jump right into it. I'm going to totally move this out of the way. If you guys online want to say something, please, by all means, say something, but I'm minimizing so I won't block any of the screen that we're seeing here in the room. Just as a thing. All right, so beginning in the exclusive seller brokerage engagement agreement, seller has a full authority to enter into this agreement. All right, so let's start right there. This is why I like reading the actual text and making sure that your clients read the actual text, which we'll get to in a second. But if somebody's signing this, they need to have the authority to sign it, right? And so you need to have that conversation. This is all about what is their rights to do this. The agreement cannot be amended except for in writing. If you fail to adhere to the terms, then you're waiving the rights of the parties later to insist on such strict adherence. So in other words, if you aren't holding them to something or they aren't holding you to something, like it doesn't exist anymore, right? So think about that as we go through things. Seller acknowledges that seller may have to pay a previous broker compensation if seller is subject to current seller brokerage agreement or has terminated previous seller brokerage agreement without the consent of the previous broker. Pretty important sentence to make sure that your seller understands. Because if you get to a closing table and your seller owes 2 people commission, they are very unhappy. Trust me, I've seen it. It's not fun. So have that conversation up front. List price and listing period. So on the first page, we just fill out the blank, right, of list price. Seller agrees to list the property for the sale at the price, list price specified. Wow, this is going to be a hard one. List price specified in this agreement. Failure of the property to be shown or sell at list price may be an indication that the list price for the property is too high. I know, right? Like we spell it out. If people read, we spell it out. If it doesn't show, if it doesn't sell, it's too high. Initial listing period when the property is under contract. So if the property is under contract to sell, as that term is defined below, during the listing period, but the listing period expires prior to closing, then the listing period shall automatically extend through the closing of the contract to sell. So you don't have to worry about it if you're towards the end of your listing agreement and, now you got 30, 60 days to close. Extensions, obviously you have the right to do an extension. You can, if during the term of this agreement, seller and a prospective buyer enter into a real property purchase and sale agreement for the property, a contract to exchange property, including the property, an option contract for the sale of the property, a contract to sell the shares or partnerships memberships, which we don't usually ever deal with, which is not consummated or closed for any reason whatsoever. And the listing period may be extended unilaterally by the broker for the number of the days that the property was under contract to sell by the broker, providing written notice of the same seller within 5 days of the contract to sell not being consummated, but in no event later than prior to the expiration of this agreement. If such written notice is not given before the end of the, then it's deemed to be waived. Remember, if you don't do it, it doesn't stay. This is a pretty important, it's kind of a change from over the years. Years ago, it just automatically extended. Now you have to actually do something. So if you want to well, not automatically, but unilaterally extend the listing period, then you need to provide something in writing, an email is sufficient, to the seller that says, hey, we were under contract for 30 days. I'm going to extend our listing agreement 30 days. But why would you want to do that?
Time on market. 6-month agreement.
So it's time on market, right? Because you said, hey, I can sell your house in 365 days or whatever the term was. And you took 30 of them away because we went under contract. Okay. What else? Why else would you want to do it? Maybe more importantly, why wouldn't you want to do it?
If you want the listing to go away.
You want the listing to go away, right? Like, suppose the reason it didn't close is because, oh, during their inspection, they found out that, oh, big issue number one is with the house, and seller said, oh, that's not an issue. We're not addressing that. Never selling, right? Okay, fine. I'm not extending, which is part of the nice reason that this is not an automatic anymore, because you just don't do it and it goes away eventually, right? All right. You guys online can talk as well if you would like. Please feel free. Marketing. Let's talk about marketing. Broker is authorized to market and advertise the property. I promise I'm not going to read the whole thing. Basically, general section is I can choose whatever I want to do to market this property, and the seller's going to indemnify me, and I don't need any additional approvals from the seller to market the property and the likeness of the property in places. Does that make sense? Also can put a sign on the property. The other section here towards the end of that is that, of course, you can market as under contract and as sold upon the closing. An important little paragraph there in the parentheses is that, of course, if you put a sold sign on a property and, of course, it's no longer owned by the seller, this doesn't really give you permission to do that because you have to talk to the new owner from that perspective. So that's my thought. Images, seller agrees to remove any personal property prior to listing the property. This is important. You should point this one out. If they don't want stuff in the pictures, like they have a original Picasso on the wall and they don't want everybody in the world to know that they have an original Picasso on the wall, take it down and put it in storage somewhere, right? Like you don't want that as part of the house if that's your concern. Multiple listing services. We are going to, within 1 business day of the marketing commencement date, make the property available in the MLSs. Does that make sense? And then it talks about all the other different things, internet marketing that only goes to other licensees and all of those sorts of things. Again, seller indemnifies. These contracts are written to protect you, right? Like just being really honest. All right. Consent of seller to be called. This is an important one. If the seller's on a do not call list, seller expressly consents to broker calling seller for any purposes related to the sale of the property. And this paragraph shall survive termination of this agreement. So you can always call them forever and ever related to selling their property. Lockboxes. Obviously, a lockbox should be used if I'm showing the property, and there have been isolated incidences of reported burglaries on homes on which lockboxes have been placed, and for which the lockbox has been alleged to have been used to access the home. Alleged. I will tell you from personal experience, these super lock boxes that we have, it is easier to break in the house than it is to break into that little box. I took a sledgehammer and a chisel and it took me an hour of beating on that thing to get the key out. So it is not something that people are going to break into unless they have, somehow have a lockbox key, which is pretty regulated. So this should be not an issue. Not to mention you'd be able to tell who they were. And then, yeah, we recommend against the use of lockboxes on door handles that can be unscrewed from the outside. If you have a door handle that can be unscrewed from the outside, we recommend you get a new door handle because that's not really functional. But anyway, again, seller agrees to remove all valuables, prescription drugs, and keys and put them in a secure place, right? Don't leave the iPads lying around on the counter like those things grow legs and walk away. You should talk to your sellers about that. This last one, I think, is very important to have a conversation with your sellers. It's not a blank that is going to come up if you're just filling out the blanks. And it says no marketing by the seller. What does that mean? Don't you want your seller to talk about the fact that their house is for sale? Talk about, okay. So it says they're encouraged to communicate the availability of the property to friends and other acquaintances. However, since we've been hired to exclusively market, they shall not prepare and distribute marketing materials, hold open houses, put up signs, create websites, prepare flyers, brochures, or videos, engage in similar activity without the written consent of the broker. What does that mean? What should you do? Shouldn't you want your seller to send to the Google group that they're in the neighborhood or the whatever that they're a part of, that their house is for sale and hey, come check it out? What should they send?
A link to something we've created for them.
I'm gonna start calling on people online here in a second.
Send our.
Send our marketing material. Yes.
Mhm.
We need to send, we need to provide them something they can send on our behalf, right? Because what does that do for you? This is gonna be
Applies the exposure and.
it increases the exposure of the property, but it also increases the exposure of you as a real estate agent. So it's important that people do that. I'm going to pop back up here for just a second. Robin, can you hear us? Okay, can you talk just to make sure we can hear you?
I can. I'm talking now. Can you hear me?
No, we cannot hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, now we can hear you.
Can
Okay.
you hear me now? Okay.
Yes. Okay, perfect. I just want to make sure I wasn't, y'all are all being very quiet this morning, so I'm trying to,
Yeah.
all right.
I wondered because I did respond to your
See, we couldn't
query
hear
about
you.
what we should send them.
I got you.
What about the seller's social media?
Same thing. Provide them something that they can post on their social media. Do a social media post and then have them share it. Right? Those are all good things because you want them to be sending something that you created. That's the ideal. But yeah, you want to leverage their network, right? I mean, if you have a Taylor Swift as a client and she has 1 million followers, you probably want her to post on her social media that her house is for sale. Well, she might not want to, but whatever. All right, moving on. Compensation. Hey, this is a pretty hot topic these days. Remember 4 when we were filling out all the little blanks? This is all the stuff that goes with it. The obligation to pay compensation to the seller's broker. In the event the seller enters into a contract to sell or lease purchase, or lease with the option to purchase the property or any portion thereof during the term of this agreement with any buyer, seller agrees to pay seller's broker compensation at the closing, regardless of whether the closing is during or after the term of this agreement. And if applicable, seller's broker leasing compensation prior to the commencement of the lease purchase, or lease with purchase option. Optional compensation of the buyer's broker. I know I'm reading these, but they're important to get all of it. Seller shall have no obligation to pay the compensation to the buyer's broker. Pretty straightforward, right? This is why we recommend that you do the, hey, seller, pay me my part. Hey, seller, how much do you want to pay their part? Right? None of this, pay me a big chunk and I'll share some of it with them. That I think is going to go away, or should go away. However, some sellers approve such compensation being offered and paid for by either the seller or the seller's broker. We prefer the seller to pay it. If the seller has agreed to pay the compensation, then of course it's paid in full at closing. And then of course, if they don't agree, then the buyer is solely responsible for paying their broker. Make sense? Separate compensation on a lease. How many people leave this blank or just say NA? Do you ever fill this out on a listing? Yes? Okay, what do you put?
I actually have a stipulation that Marcy has never objected to.
Oh, that's good.
And it says, my concern is somebody leases for 3 months,
Mhm.
and if you say 1/12 of that amount,
That's not much.
that's not much, and it's not worth doing paperwork for.
Right.
So it says something about the equivalent of 1 month's lease for.
No more
Or
than
1/12 of the total amount, because if they lease for 3 years, then you want
1/12.
1/12 of the total. amount.
for sure.
So I have to just, on the front page, just write see special stipulations about this.
So I think part of the thing that's important about this understanding of the lease is in a market where properties don't sell. Now, we're in a market where properties typically sell, but we're in that flex time, I think, as we got the reaction from the room, is that you have to be careful that somebody might come along and want to lease the property. And your seller might all of a sudden decide that that's an okay thing. So if there's any chance at all of that happening, which there pretty much is for all of them, why not protect yourself and put something in here, right? So that's just something to think about as we go forward from that.
But you don't have to put an amount of the actual lease,
On the first page where there's a blank, you'll need to fill in
a number.
numbers, something.
Right,
Yeah.
It doesn't have to say $1,000.
No, it
As
just
long as
has
it
to
can
be
say
something that's
some amount.
discernible. Yes. A real calculatable number. That's not a question. All right, moving forward. We are so struggling here. This is a long document, so just bear with us. Protected period. This one's an important one. No, almost all agents don't understand how the protected period works. It's very important. Protected period shall be the period set forth in this agreement commencing upon the expiration or the unilateral termination of the agreement, during which the compensation is protected. If the agreement is unilaterally terminated by the seller without consent to the broker, the protected period shall be the number of days remaining on the original listing, plus whatever set forth in the protected period section. So you get your full time period. This is why that, hey, seller, you might owe a previous broker. This is why. There shall be no protected period if the broker and seller mutually terminate. Right? That makes sense. I had somebody not that long ago ask me about that, but the reality is that if you as the agent terminate the contract with the consent of the seller, you're consenting that there's no more obligation, right? Like that's what mutual termination is. Oh, cripe, I lost myself. And then there shall be, in the event that during the protected period, the seller enters into a contract to sell, then of course, it says if it was identified or shown by any buyer, was provided specific information about or inquired about the property, either directly or through a broker working with the buyer, then the seller shall pay the broker at closing. That part's a little confusing to a lot of people. Because what's the reality is that if your marketing generated the interest in the property, then they owe you a commission. How do you determine that? Well, you're the only one doing marketing, right? So therefore, if they saw the property, it's because of you. Does that make sense? Pretty much.
Hold up.
For the most part. I mean, it has to be an extreme circumstance that it doesn't. If the agreement expires, it's not unilaterally terminated, then the obligation shall an exception to the above compensation obligations is that if they entered into another listing agreement with somebody else, right? So if this expires, you're protected until they list with someone else. Now, that doesn't mean they started talking to somebody else. That means they have a signed listing agreement. So you should pay attention to that. Okay. Compensation rights, of course, survive the termination of the agreement. Agency and brokerage. This part is pretty straightforward. We've seen it in other things. Broker's policy on agency, these are the possibilities, the dual agency disclosure. Obviously, if we do dual agency, then we need to make sure everybody understands all of those. Designated agency, which is, I think, fine. And just again, it explains that. And no other adverse agency relationships. So in other words, there's no other things that would conflict with any interests of the seller. Does that make sense? Those are pretty straightforward. We've seen those before, so we'll push through those quick because I'm watching the clock to try and make sure I get through the end. Lead-based paint disclosure. This one's an important one. We picked up on this in the last class, but we're going to say it again because I think it's important. If any portion of the residential dwelling was built prior to 1978. Now, this is always the big question. I put in an antique fireplace mantle in my 2024 house. Was any portion of the dwelling built prior to 1978?
No.
I mean, the answer is yes, if that mantle was built in, 1902, right? Because the mantle is built into the house. Now, if I have in my house one of those old, whatever buffet things. I can't even think this morning. Cabinet of some sort that goes in the kitchen, right? And it's old. It's definitely prior to 1978. Do I need to say that part of my house was built prior to 1978? No, it's loose. It rolls around. So
It's furniture.
it's furniture. It doesn't count. But a mantle is part of the house, right? If I got an old bookshelf type thing, cabinet, whatever, and I build it into the house and build it into the wall, well, now it's not furniture. It's part of the house. So if it's part of the house was built prior to 1978, then yes, you need to get a lead-based paint disclosure. If there's a question, if you think it might be, well, then you probably should do it. But don't do it just to do it. Because if your house wasn't built prior to 1978, there's no reason to do it. This section here says that it needs to be attached as an exhibit to this agreement. That means you need to get that filled out when you're having a listing agreement signed. It needs to be put into this as an exhibit. Okay? Very important. That protects you in that you now have it before anybody has a chance to look at it, potentially buy it, and you have that available. Special circumstances. These are those special circumstances of the list. If you remember, getting a divorce, getting bankruptcy, whatever, all those types of things. And it basically says, if the third party approval is required, then the seller is responsible for trying to fulfill all of that and make sure that the purchase and sale agreement is subject to any such contingency and condition, right? So if I need the judge's approval, the purchase and sale agreement needs to say, I need the judge's approval. That's an important piece, but it does put that responsibility back on the seller. Personally, I think you as an agent need to be paying attention to that and make sure they don't sign documents that require them to sell something that they can't sell. Slight different thing. We have to keep all that confidential. So for instance, if they say, hey, I'm going through a divorce, but I don't want anybody to know, you can't tell anybody. Of course, you still have to find some way to put it in the purchase and sale agreement, so you got to work through that. But that is what it is. And you can't give false information, obviously. And there's, in the event of conflict of the broker's duty not to give customers false information and the duty to keep confidences of the seller, not giving false information prevails, right? Can't lie. Negotiation, we can assist. This is, of course, remember, it's a checkbox that they want you to assist. But of course, the seller is the final say on everything to make clear. All right, a little bit additional thing. Seller's property disclosure statement. I think this is an important one to make sure that your seller reads. So many sellers kind of try to ignore this. This says the Georgia law, and it cites it, requires that a seller disclose known latent defects in the property which could not be observed by a buyer upon a reasonable inspection of the property. This is the case even if the property is sold in as-is condition. Within 3 days of the date of this agreement, there's a timeline. Not when you get to it, it's within 3 days of the date of this agreement. The seller agrees to provide broker with a current, fully executed seller's property disclosure statement. It gives the different options or disclosure of latent defects and fixtures checklist. The broker is hereby authorized to distribute that and to buyers. And of course, the seller agrees to promptly update any of the above referenced disclosures through the closing should any changes occur. Lawsuit, lawsuit, lawsuit. Red flag, lawsuit. Hope everyone's paying attention. If you know that something changes and you don't get that disclosure updated, you're putting yourself in a world of hurt. So make sure that if the property floods or whatever happens, just change the disclosure. It's easy. Okay. Hazardous conditions on the property. Seller acknowledges that the broker has no duty to inspect the property for defects, hazardous conditions, repairs, or anything else. It's the seller's duty to keep responsible care of the property. Okay. And then, of course, buyers and all those sorts of things. This is a big, it's all in bold in caps, right? They need to read this. Mainly, this is, hey, if somebody gets hurt in the property, it's not our fault. It's the biggest part of it. Limits on the broker's authority and responsibility. This goes through all of the limitations that a broker has in a listing agreement. Okay, think about it. How many times in your career has a seller gotten upset because you showed a prospective buyer somebody else's another listing? Right? It says right here that you're going to do that. We don't have any duty to inspect the property. All of those things. Those are all things that rely on the sellers. You should read through that whole paragraph. I'm not going to bore you with it right now.
Ask a question?
Yes, please.
All right, so,
Speak loud.
so August 17th,
Yes.
we are doing an open house. Unrepresented buyer comes in and they're like, we really like this house, but there's this other house down the street that we need to see before we know if we want to make an offer on your seller's house, my seller's house.
Mm-hmm.
So I say, okay, great, it's vacant, I can take you there after the open house. That's up until August 17th. Now, after August 17th, am I allowed to take them? Because I'm representing my seller to take them to this other house, which I know is in horrible condition and overpriced, and it's going to make them want to put an offer on my seller's house. So am I allowed to take that buyer to that house to
No.
serve my seller?
Sort of. With paperwork.
So I need a customer
Customer
agreement with
acknowledgement.
them.
Is what I would say. At minimum, you need you need some kind of brokerage relationship to explain to them if they end up buying a house, you're going to get paid. if that makes sense.
What if, but you're not, what if they buy that other house? You're not, you don't care, you don't wanna represent them, even as a customer on that other house, right? You're doing it solely to try to get the offer on your side. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I
agree
know,
with you.
that's why I love you being in the classes.
I mean, literally, you're in an open house, you're closing it down, and they're like, and they're like, well, we love this, but we need to see that house down the street. And you're like, well, I can get you in there, and then we can be working on an offer on my seller's house and out.
I would still do a customer acknowledgement. And here's why, because if they're gonna do an offer on your listing, you still want the customer acknowledgement anyway. Now, the customer acknowledgement might say that they're not gonna pay you anything,
Okay.
right? And we'll talk about that when we get to it, but I think that's part of what you have to provide them is explanation of agency.
We can't just run into that
You
house.
can't just run into the house anymore, right? Because you're acting as an agent. And so you gotta do that. So I think that's important to understand. This section, I think, is very important to make sure the seller reads it. Almost to the extent that I might make them initial next to it. Because these are like, it's really heavily weighted towards making sure the seller understands that you're not going to do all these things for them. Like there are things they have to do for themselves. They're responsible, for instance, we are not responsible for making sure they comply with the duties and deadlines of the contract. Like if they miss a deadline, that's on them. Now, should we help them? Yes. But at the end of the day, we can't make them, we can't act on their behalf, right? We don't have any authority on behalf other than what's set forth in this, which means we can't do anything on their behalf without their written consent. We can have no authority, this bottom one, which is a little squishy, shall have no authority to bind the seller to any contract to sell or give notices. They have to sign stuff or else it's not binding. Make sense? It seems like an obvious point, I know, but you'd be surprised at how many times I've seen that not done properly. All right. Limit on the broker's liability. Again, this one is all caps and now super bold. Not liable for anything. We're not liable for anything. That's basically what it says, right? And that the largest compensation, if there's no compensation paid, right? We're liable for the limit of the compensation. We might have to give the money back. Or if there was no compensation paid, $100. It's very limiting. They should know that. Disclosure of potentially fraudulent activities. This one's an important one to point out. Hey, by the way, if a buyer comes along and it seems like they're doing mortgage fraud, we have to tell someone. We can't just let them buy your house with fraud. It's a thing. So that's just the way it is. Arbitration, I'm not gonna, this is the miscellaneous stuff. Assignability is, it's important that it says the seller consensus agreement be assigned by broker to other brokerage firm. So, if one firm is sold to another firm, then you go with it. That's part of the thing. Attorney's fees, definition of seller and buyer, obviously. Disclaimer regarding for the sale of certain property. This is the one that's within a 10-mile radius of a military base, just as a caveat. Make sure you understand that. If you happen to be within 10 miles of military base, entire agreement, fair housing disclosure. Sometimes, unfortunately, you have to point this one out to people. Right? Like, hey, seller, I know you would like whatever to buy your house. The reality is I'm not going to limit it to that, right? Like the reality is that under fair housing, I need to show it to everyone. And I'm not going to limit who can possibly buy your house, and you shouldn't either. FERPTA affidavit, which is the foreign investment thing, of course, is the additional taxes. If you've never dealt with that, please let them know ahead of time, because when they get to the closing table and a big chunk of money is withheld by the attorney, they get real mad. GAR forms, which is just the commentary of all the GAR forms, governing law, independent contractor relationships, so we're not employees, no imputed knowledge, notices between the seller and broker. Hey, everything needs to be in writing, right? Very important. Referrals. Hey, seller hereby authorizes broker to refer seller to another real estate licensee for anything not related to the sale of the property. It's okay. Statute limitation, survival. Obviously, the things that need to survive, like compensation, survive. Third-party vendors, we may provide you with those, but those are your responsibility to check out. Time is of the essence. Use of the NA, which means not applicable. Brokers and sellers' duties, brokers' duties to the seller. This is it. Remember, in a lot of this new world settlement conversations that I've seen people talking about, like, oh yeah, I have a list of 200 things that I do for my sellers. Great. You can talk about those 200 things, but please don't make those part of the contract. These 5 things are the things that you're responsible to the seller for, period. And it should be all that you're responsible for. And you need to be careful not to be more than that. These are pretty straightforward things, but again, make sure that you're following them, presenting, disclosing material facts, all that kind of stuff. Seller's duty, important that they know what their duties are, right? Because we've all had those sellers that get in their own way. This is the paragraph to use to help them understand how to not get in their own way. Number 5, carefully read all contracts to sell before signing them. Super important. Point it out. Give them a copy of the GAR contract so they can read it at their leisure and then go back and read the ones. Seller defaults. I'm not going to read through all of this, but basically, these are all the ways the seller can default on the contract. Okay? If the seller defaults, the broker remedies. A seller shall immediately pay broker the compensation referenced herein for any of the seller defaults above, except for the seller unilaterally terminating this agreement prior to the end of the listing agreement, as the same may have been extended as provided herein. With respect to this event of default, seller's obligation to pay broker its compensation shall be controlled by the protected period sections of the agreement. Make sense? So any of the defaults other than them terminating, they owe you commission, compensation, or we're calling it these days. If they terminate, then it rolls back to the protected period of why they would pay you or not pay you. Okay. Cyber fraud. Tell people about it. I heard one just the other day. We had a attorney's email get spoofed, and the buyer luckily called the agent and was like, hey, well, were we changing the wiring instructions? No, we're not. Please don't wire your funds to Russia. We need them to be here. So yes, please make sure people understand that, because it is still happening. People forget. It's been a long time since this started. People are still doing it. Okay. All right, let's talk about the agreement. We got like 20 minutes to talk about this one. There's a lot to this, a lot more than there used to be. If you've used this form in the past, it was usually pretty straightforward. It's got a lot more to it now than it used to. So, your agreement to work with a buyer as a customer, it explains that you are only treating them as a customer. You are not doing anything other than ministerial task on behalf of the buyer. Okay? What's the one way to make sure they understand that?
Have them initial beside it.
Somebody online is talking, but we're not hearing them. Let's try this.
Have them initial beside that paragraph, Brett.
You could have them initial next to that paragraph. What else could you do? If you're trying to explain agency to them, what's the best form to give them?
ABC.
ABCs of agency. Make sure you give them the ABCs of agency. So it'll be listed at the bottom, but that's one of the best ways to do it. Customer acknowledgement regarding compensation of the broker. Broker will have the right to share the compensation being paid to the seller's broker on any property purchased by the buyer if the broker is the procuring cause of the sale. Okay. Arbitration obviously explains that we're going to do arbitration instead of lawsuits. It's always our first path. Compensation. This is where it gets fun. Compensation of the buyer's broker. Now, in Chris's example earlier, where he was showing a house down the street to somebody that was looking at buying his listing, is he putting compensation in paragraph B? Remember, paragraph B is what you're willing to work for. This is the same as the buyer's brokerage agreement. From the standpoint of paragraph B is the minimum that you're working for as an agent.
So this is relative to the other house that he is at.
But it's also relative to his listing. Well, but if in his example, if they want to buy the other house, he's not going to help them buy the other house. And he should, by the way, stipulate that in here. But we'll, you know, when you get to the special stip section, I would personally, if that was my intention, hey, I'm going to show you this house, but if you want to buy it, you need to go find somebody else to help you because I'm not doing it. Right? Okay, so I'm protecting myself. Make sure you understand. And by the way, if you want to write an offer on my house, I'm going to need this form anyway. Right? So I filled this out and I'm probably going to put 0 in there because my compensation comes from my client.
Unless your seller is not paying a buyer broker compensation.
And this is where,
Want paid for all of that work.
right. So this is where the way you fill out the listing agreement is very important to understand in comparison to how you fill this out, right? So if you filled out the listing agreement that you get 4 bananas for helping list the property and they don't want to pay a buyer's broker any bananas, when you fill this out, if you put 0 there, you're getting nothing from the seller other than the 4 bananas, right? Now, as we talked about, if you are the person that wants to get more bananas when there's an unrepresented client, which I think is perfectly reasonable since you do more work, then you should special stip that in the listing agreement. Now, if you special stip that in the listing agreement that, hey, instead of 4 bananas, I get 8 bananas if there's an unrepresented customer or buyer that comes through. If I put 0 in B, am I still okay?
Wait, so in the listing agreement, we are saying that as the seller's agent, the seller will pay 8 bananas.
Correct.
Not 4 bananas for us doing the work with the seller's agent and 4 bananas for us doing
Correct.
the work on the buyer side. Then these can all be 0s.
These can be 0s because
Your seller
the seller has already agreed to compensate you for an unrepresented buyer
on the seller side.
on the seller's side.
There's no buyer.
There's no buyer compensation. You are literally saying, hey, buyer, you're not paying anything to me. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, this is where it gets a little bit funky. And sorry, that was just section B, just to be clear. The optional compensation from the seller or seller's broker to the buyer's broker. So this is where it gets a little fuzzy because the seller has agreed to pay you as their listing agent extra bananas if there's an unrepresented buyer? Shouldn't you disclose that to the buyer, that the seller is going to pay you that?
Well, if we're disclosing that, then we need to disclose any compensation that the seller is paying to the listing broker. Like, it doesn't matter what it is then. I mean, if you're saying the extra, well, how does the buyer even know what the base amount is to determine the extra, right? So,
And so that's the part that gets a little funny, because this section says that it's optional compensation from the seller or the seller's broker to the buyer's broker. But technically, we're not really the buyer's broker. We kind of are the buyer's broker because we're treating them as a customer, but we're still the buyer's broker on this side. I think out of extreme caution, if I was getting 4 bananas from the seller for an unrepresented buyer, I'd throw that in here. I wouldn't put in what I'm getting paid to represent the seller, because that's our part on the other side. But I would say, hey, in here, I probably need to disclose and make sure that the customer acknowledges that they approve, important, they check that little box that says they approve that the seller's paying you 4 more bananas.
So what if they disapprove?
Then they can go find somebody else to fill out the contract, I guess.
then technically they are interfering with an existing contract. And in Georgia, you can't do that.
Yes, that is also the case.
So,
To clarify for those online, in case you couldn't hear Chris, if they say, oh, we don't approve of you that, and you have it as a special stipulation in your listing agreement, they are violating the law by interfering with an existing contract. Okay, so they can't really do that. Some people will still try, but you should point out that, look, that's my contract with the seller. I just wanted you to know that that's what's happening. And they may say, well, wait a minute, if it's only going to cost me 2 more bananas to go get my own agent, shouldn't I go get my own agent? Absolutely, yes, you should. Right? Like that's the conversation. And that's up to them, right? But this discloses that, so they now have that information to know, hey, I'm not using an agent, so I'm saving a bunch of commission. Well, this is it. This is the real number, so that they know what it is.
but if we go back to our listing agreement, it's not the real number. Because in the listing agreement, it really, I would like, this is in the list of 1,000 things we need clarification on going forward, and you're not gonna know the answer, and I'm not gonna answer. But then the devil's advocate is, as a listing, on the listing side, it's all coming from seller to listing broker. Our seller is paying the buyer's broker 0 if we are working with the buyer's broker. So it really, I mean.
But in this case,
But we're saying if we're always taking the numbers from the listing agreement to fill in here, I understand the disclosure thing, and I agree we should tell them. But this is where, like, I think this is where these forms need to get reworked, and I think it's California has actually come up with a section on their form that there's an unrepresented buyer. Seller pays listing broker when an unrepresented buyer is present. Like, that is actually a checkbox disclosure in all of their forms. And I think
right.
probably.
Well, California forms are also significantly larger than ours.
But I mean, that may be coming on ours.
It could.
Like,
But remember that where we're getting confused is that we're thinking, oh, there's no buyer's broker.
but there is.
But there is, because it's us with this agreement to work. The buyer hereby agrees to work with the broker. The buyer's broker shall not be representing the buyer as a client, but only working with them as a customer. So we're still the buyer's broker and the listing broker, the seller's broker, right? And so all of this compensation talk about the seller paying us for the work that we're doing with the buyer, which is those additional bananas, needs to be disclosed. But what they're paying us as representing the seller is never any of them, right? That's not on any of these disclosures. Because that's what we're getting paid to market and represent the seller. So it's a different conversation. Obviously part D, if you put 0 in the first part and 4 bananas in the second part, doesn't really relate because those are not like, I mean, I think I would just say, yeah, I'd probably not reduce because if you reduce 0, then you get negative, like you don't want somebody to interpret it that way. All right. When compensation is due, obviously it's due at the closing of the property. Now, this is a difference in this agreement than other agreements. Buyer shall be obligated to pay buyer's broker the compensation referenced above at the closing date of any property. Okay, so assume we're not doing and we're getting commission in this, that was shown to or identified by a buyer's broker. So for instance, Chris takes them to show that other house, and they do want to buy that other house, and he wrote in something other than 0 in that first section, in section B here. Then within the later of blank days of the date of the agreement, or the last date that the buyer's broker showed any property to the buyer, notwithstanding the above section, shall not apply if buyers entering an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement with another broker. So in other words, I can fill out this customer agreement and they get into the process and think, okay, I'm going to write an offer. You know, I think I'm going to go get my own agent and I'm going to enter into a buyer brokerage agreement. What happens to this agreement? It goes, right? Just like when your listing agreement expires and they enter into a listing agreement. This one doesn't need to expire for that to be the case. It's if they enter into a buyer brokerage agreement, this goes poof because they have the right to be represented, as much as they seem to be fighting that in court.
But if they don't, isn't this like another protected period?
It is sort of, but again, it's really just a very short period of you showing them the property, right? Like it's not super long. But yes, it's effectively the length of this contract, because otherwise you enter into this contract on today, and when does it go away? This is the when it goes away. Okay. So whether you're going to give them 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever to buy that, then that's what it is. Definitions, which are similar to anything we've ever seen before. Limited liability, of course, all bold, like we've seen before. Independent contractor, we've seen before. Buyer's duties, again, we've seen before. Although, of course, G is a fun one because it's work non-exclusively with the broker in identifying, previewing, and seeing property for purchase by the buyer, right? So because this is it's a customer agreement. There's no exclusivity to it. They can work with as many people as they want if you have a customer agreement, which is important to explain to them. Like if they want somebody else showing them properties also, then so be it, because this is only functional if you show them the property. Now, why you would use this instead of a buyer brokerage agreement, this is really, as I said, why we're looking at it now. It's really for listing agents, right? You have somebody come in unrepresented to your listing. This is why I personally would only use this. Fair housing disclosures, disclaimer regarding certain property, again, 10-mile radius. Statute of limitations is 2 years. Warnings of cyber fraud and identity theft. Covenant not to sue. I love that in all bold. This section, check them all, right? You got an unrepresented customer, unrepresented buyer. You should overeducate the shit out of them, right? Like you want to make sure there's no question that they understood the risk of buying a condominium or a community association or any of those things. Now, you might say, well, my listing is not a condo. Great, I don't care. Give it to them anyway. Right? Because I would want them, and I would say to them, look, hey, I'm gonna send you all of these because I want to make sure you're educated because I cannot advise you. All I can do is fill in the blanks at your direction, which means you need to understand what's going on, which means I'm going to send you all this so you read it.
Well,
Your responsibility.
as a practical matter, in Chris's example, you know, he's buttoning up an open house. You can send them all that, they're never gonna have a chance to read it.
Well, they'll have a chance to read it. All this is saying is that we sent them to them,
Right,
right?
I get it.
So I can do that on my phone through dot loop and click, 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 boom, send, and it's done, right?
Send.
So they have it. Now, they should read it before they start executing anything else, right? But from a reality standpoint, this is what we have. And then, of course, special stipulation section. Again, if you're really talking about this only applies to listing blah, 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 then by all means, put that in there, right? I don't think there's any issue with that. But again, if you went and showed them that house down the street and they said, hey, I think I'd rather buy the house down the street, you can now execute a buyer brokerage agreement with them that would make this go poof, even though you already had this in place for the showing. It's a little convoluted, but I think that would be the path if that's what you wanted to do.
Something else I think we need to be cognizant of as agents, writing special stipulations that say, oh, you know, I will take less, I as the agent will take less than this. All of these agreements are
Broker.
between the broker.
Yep.
And the buyer or the seller. So if as a listing agent, you say to your seller, if an unrepresented buyer comes along, I will take X amount, I will take 2 bananas instead of 3 on the buyer side to benefit you, my seller. If we're writing a stipulation of that or putting it in the other section, we need to be careful because we can't say listing broker, because then that means if Chad does that and I go to buy one of Chad's listings, the seller's gonna say, well, it's broker, broker, remax, remax. There's only 3 bananas to Chad and 2 bananas here, even though Chad told me there were 3 because, right? So we have to somehow distinguish between listing agent and listing broker.
Yep.
And that's where us doing all this like stuff on the side, I think is gonna get really, really
It does.
complicated.
So like anything with special steps, if you can't use a pre-written one, have someone else look at it before you put it in there. Whether it's an attorney that you trust or one of us as a broker, have somebody else look at it to make sure that it says what you want it to say, not what you think it says, which sometimes those don't line up.
Could we do in the next couple of weeks, could we do just a 15-minute conversation with how, as a listing agent, how we have a group talk about how we think we want to fill out those sections, specifically as we as listing agents want to deal with unrepresented buyers, and how we want to have that conversation with our sellers. I'm not saying we have to have an office policy, but I'm really curious, like, how a couple of other people feel
Sure.
like.
No, I think that's one of the things we need to
And I-
have
I
open
think it's
conversations
important,
about.
right? Because
Yes.
it's like, if we have to disclose it no matter what to an unrepresented buyer, then do you even need to jump through hoops with your seller to say other things? Because if the buyer has to approve it anyway.
But I think it's important, like, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of, okay, I put a special stip in my listing agreement that says if there's an unrepresented buyer, then there's only, there's an extra 2 bananas instead of 12 bananas or whatever it is, right? In that case, if you were on Chad's listing bringing a buyer, that buyer's not unrepresented. They are represented.
Unless unless they're only a customer.
Unless they're a customer,
Because
which,
they were at my open house and I
Correct.
took them to Chad's listing.
and so that's where you have to be careful about using this. And in that case, you would upgrade from a customer to a broker, buyer brokerage agreement, in theory, assuming that the buyer is okay with that. But yes, if you don't, you could end up in a situation where you're not getting as many bananas as you wanted, or any bananas at all for that matter. You might be hungry. So, I mean, that's just part of the thing to think about. And that's why it's important that you're paying attention more than ever on all of those types of things. There's no question on all of these that you should be stressing to them that they should read all of these, because you have to remind them that you are not advising them. Okay. Signatures. This is super important. There's this big, huge, bold paragraph at the top that says very clearly, hey, by the way, when you sign this, you're acknowledging that you've read it all, you understand it all, and that you're not subject to any exclusive buyer brokerage engagements. 3 big, very important points. Just like with your buyer's brokerage agreement and your listing agreement, in this case, when you have a buyer sign this, you need to get all of their information. Fill out the whole thing. All of their information needs to be on here. It needs to have an address. It needs to have a phone number. It needs to have an email address, because you want to have multiple ways to get in touch with them should you need to. Okay, or should we need to. Same thing for your block. Make sure everything's filled out and has all the correct contact information for everybody. And then, of course, the receipt of the copy of the agreement is acknowledged by the buyer. You should be doing that the same way you do that with the buyer brokerage agreement or the listing agreement. And look at that. We only went like 2 minutes over. I think that's pretty good.
Very-
Questions, thoughts, anything at this point? Look at all these fun people on here. I think, there's a lot of stuff. My goodness. There's, a lot to be considered, as Chris was pointing out. This is going to be a continuous conversation. This is not the end of it. Don and I are meeting actually here shortly to go through some of this stuff and put together more best practices and written suggestion on this is how you should do this is how you should do this kind of thing, because it's important for you to understand what you're doing. Ask questions. Please, 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 please ask before you send something, whether it's an email, whether it's a document, a special step, whatever it is. Ask us and we'll help protect you. That's what we're here for. That's part of our job.
Brett,
So please do.
Brett,
Yes.
when's the next GAR class?
Next Tuesday. Every Tuesday except for Tuesdays that we have sales meeting, we have a GAR class.
Brett, this is an incredible service, and I really appreciate you doing this.
No, I'm happy to do it. I love the contracts and love talking about them, as you can kind of tell. Because they're not as simple as people think they are, right? Everybody thinks, oh, I just fill in the blanks and I'm fine. You'd be surprised at how many times that fine turns out to be a nightmare. And I've seen it, unfortunately, way too many times in my extended career here. So please, please, please ask questions before you do something that you're not sure of. To John's point, we have lots of these classes. We've gone through purchase and sale agreement. We've gone through, and many of you have been with us along the whole way. If you haven't, they're all uploaded on YouTube. You can go back and watch them at your leisure. And if it puts you to sleep at night, feel free. Maybe you'll hear it as you're sleeping and get even more out of it. But anyway, I appreciate you all coming. Thank you for making sure that you're protecting your clients and yourselves and us as we deal with the changes that are happening in our industry, which is not any big deal other than everything changes all the time. So just be aware, and we'll go from there. Thank you all again for coming. I'm going to stop recording. Maybe.